Everybody, welcome to Krystal, Kyle, and Friends. Very excited about the gentleman who will be joining us today for our interview. Ken Klippenstein, phenomenal reporter for The Intercept, really goes deep on a lot of national security stories, on a lot of sort of corporate power and abuse stories, talking to rank and file workers, rank and file folks working at these agencies, and digging up the things that, frankly, oftentimes the mainstream media has no interest in.
Yeah, unrelated, but do you think people confuse, like, they say Ken Klippenstein to him sometimes, or is it always Steen? Do you get the sense that there's a little bit of confusion on that front?
I feel like there always is.
Yeah.
I'm even questioning myself right now.
Right, yeah. No, I think you're right. I think it's Klippenstein.
Okay.
We could just call him...
I just say it with, when I'm not sure about a name, my go-to move is just to say it with a lot confidence and
because then what happens is even if you're wrong, people are like, oh, she's obviously right about that.
Got that down.
Yeah. No, it'll be good. Ken does a great job over at The Intercept.
He also has an amazing Twitter feed.
He does. Hilarious. Yeah, if you go through the list of the stories he's covered, it's banger after banger. So
Indeed.
Definitely looking forward to it. But before we get into that, this clip was very, very interesting to me because it made me think. And I like stuff that I don't necessarily agree with, but it makes me think. That's that's the stuff that I'm always searching out. I don't need anybody to
gravitate towards that.
Yeah, I don't want anybody to, confirm my priors. I know what they are and I know what I think, and I can give you 1,000 different arguments for the things I think. Tell me, disagree with me, but in a way that's really thoughtful. And I'm like, ooh, this is interesting, you know what I mean? So this is kind of what happens here with Jon Stewart. I don't know if I fully disagree. It's like half agree, half disagree. But anyway, we'll get into all that. Jon Stewart was at the New Yorker Festival, and he was asked an interesting question on cancel culture, and here's his response.
A lot of voices now, John, are like Bill Maher, for example, when it comes to the culture wars. He expresses his frustration over and over again. I can't say this. We're limited in saying that. We have to wear a gag, and this kind of expression. Comedians are talking all the time about, well, I feel I can't do this, I can't say that.
No,
how do you come down on this?
All the people who talk about cancel culture, here's a nice absurdity.
Okay.
People that talk about cancel culture never seem to shut the fuck up about it. Like, there's more speech now than ever before. It's not you can't say, it's that when you say it, look, the internet has democratized criticism. What do we do for a living? We talk shit. We criticize, we postulate, we opine, we make jokes, and now other people are having their say. And that's not cancel culture, that's relentlessness. We live in relentless culture. And the system of the internet and all those other things are incentivized to find the pressure points of that and exacerbate it.
So before I give my thoughts on it, I want to get your initial thoughts on that.
Okay, so sometimes when we talk about cancel culture, which, by the way, is just a phrase that I absolutely hate, part of why I hate it is because I think people talk about different things. There is a lot of whining from people with gigantic platforms, people like Bill Maher, about criticism that they receive and the attendant cancel culture. Oftentimes, these are people who have platforms that are more or less protected, or they're wealthy individuals. They're going to be fine even if they weather a little bit of controversy, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think as what Stewart is saying is applied to that class of people, I think he's definitely got a point there. There is a lot of just whining about people being mean to me on Twitter, and I should be able to have my view, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, without facing any sort of pushback. And that, that I think is sort of silly. The part that he misses and doesn't talk about is oftentimes people who don't have gigantic social media followings or gigantic media platforms, don't have tons of money. The consequences for them of having a view, attacked, or their comments attacked, or whatever it is, being deplatformed, being fired, et cetera, are far more grave. And so I think that's the part of this that there's zero nuance in this debate. There are a lot of effectively bad actors who just like to whine about this because they don't want to receive any criticism, and they sort of want that to be a bulwark to protect the status quo. But there's also a legitimate problem with an instinct that has taken hold rather than organize and have solidarity and build a political movement and have real power. I'm just going to call out this person or call out that person to signal my own moral purity.
Yeah. So I thought his comments were interesting because I'm not sure anybody has made a better defense of quote unquote cancel culture. But like you, I share the criticism that it's so annoying to hear that now, because to Jon Stewart's point, I think the truest thing he said there is that people who talk about cancel culture can't seem to shut the fuck up about cancel culture. That is so true. There are some people who it's just total one-trick pony. That's all they got. That's all they go back to. And they'll almost make a point of not talking about any economic issues, any foreign policy issues, anything that's real substantive and material and impacts people every single day, way more than cancel culture stuff.
Right.
They won't talk about that, and they'll only talk about the cancel culture
stuff. They'll talk about cancel culture and its twin wokeness. Right, everything.
Right. Well, I'm putting all into one, all into one here. Cancel culture, wokeness, political correctness / political incorrectness.
I just saw Larry Summers say that the Fed, the woke Fed, is why we have inflation, for example.
Right.
Like this just gets used in every way.
They were saying, they were blaming wokeness. They were saying it was the reconciliation bill is woke. It's like, what are you talking about? It has universal pre-K,
community
college. It has paid family leave. It has paid, there were 2 different kinds of paid leave in there. I forget the 2 different kinds of paid leave, but you get the point. It's got child tax credit in there. It's got expanded Medicare in there. It's got higher tax on theirs. That's just good policy. And you can't just throw this wet blanket over it. Wokeness. And expect people to go, fucking woke again. The fucking woke mob is coming for me to give me good things. So yes, it's a tired conversation. It's a stale conversation. That's an interesting perspective I've never heard. So yes, on the one hand, there's 2 parts to this. On the one hand, it is true, and Bill Maher's a great example of this. Cancel culture, talking about cancel culture, they use it to bitch about anything and everything, about any criticism that comes their way, even if that criticism is legitimate. And right-wingers use it in an even more nefarious way sometimes, where they'll claim you're canceling them simply when you point out like a factual inaccuracy that they make. Like I remember Ann Coulter was blaming cancel culture because she gave some shitty anecdote about an immigrant committing crime, and then somebody pointed out to her, actually, if you look at the data and the statistics, both undocumented immigrants and documented immigrants both commit crime, respectively, at a lower rate than
the domestic
American citizens who were born here. Correct. Mm-hmm. And so you point that out. Oh, with the cancel culture is coming from me. No, we are correcting you. You're not being politically incorrect. You're just being incorrect. And so now we're correcting you. So that's one part of the conversation.
Yes.
But I do think he misses one important point, which is embedded in his commentary, implied in his commentary, is this idea that, well, now that we've democratized criticism, which I agree is a good thing. It's good that we democratize criticism. I want more people to have a voice. Of course, I'm a believer in democracy.
Yeah.
But he does seem to imply that, like, all criticism is almost inherently reasonable. You know what I mean? That, like, well, you're getting all these voices, and therefore it's like the best voices are going to rise to the top, and so the criticisms are going to be reasonable, so sort of suck it up and deal with it and don't complain about it ever. And it's like, oftentimes, the criticism is fucking stupid, too. And you'll get people wanting to, and this is the other part he misses, that it's only really cancel culture to me, and it's only really a problem to me when it becomes authoritarian, which is, I want you fired, so I'm going to try to make you lose your job, or I want you deplatformed, or I want you censored, or I want to make sure, you don't get a speech at whatever place, whatever college campus you were going to give a speech. Right. That's when I draw a line and I go, no. Because even if everything you're saying is true, even if the person is racist, bigoted, and all these terrible things, you still shouldn't say, we're going to not allow you to speak at all.
I would love to get his thoughts on Abby Martin, who won a court case against an anti-BDS law in Georgia, where effectively she was supposed to give a speech at a public institution there, and as a condition of doing so, she was going to have to sign some freaking like loyalty pledge to Israel. That
I would never boycott Israel, effectively.
Right. And so she was like, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take you to court and I'm going to win. And this case points out the hypocrisy of a lot on the right when it comes to cancel culture, because probably the most widespread version of actual cancel culture has to do with standing up for the rights of human rights of Palestinians.
Right,
I mean,
like the law, they will come after you with the law is the point. Look at Ben and Jerry's.
Or all of these, I mean, how much, it's like 36 states or something that have passed these anti-BDS laws, which are completely insane and in every instance have been found to be unconstitutional where they've been challenged. Or you have these laws that are effectively trying to criminalize protest.
Anti-protest laws in over 20 states, correct.
So talk to me about that cancel culture. So he has a point there with regards to how disingenuous a lot of the conversation is and how hypocritical a lot of the conversation is here. But he assumes that the only cancel culture is basically people who are sort of more working class or everyday citizens punching up, versus oftentimes some of the cancel culture that you see where there are the kind of ramifications you're talking about are people who are like elite media or other positions of power punching down and causing issues for, you know, people who have less power than them. And that dynamic is important. And it's not just important, you know, you see the way social media companies are increasingly censoring because there's this demand from journalists and from politicians that they censor more and they, you know, only push people to CNN and New York Times, et cetera, et cetera. So it matters in terms of law. It matters in terms of individual consequences for their lives. But it also matters in terms of just, you know, there are a lot of people who will just keep their mouth shut about something because they're afraid
of consequences,
of those consequences. And that sort of curtailing and limiting of the ability of that, like preemptive limiting of free speech, I think is also a major problem.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the reason why he has the perspective he has is because he's a comedian and he's in comedian circles. And in comedian circles, this is sort of like the go-to thing when, for whatever reason, you're not getting the reaction that you want to get. And sometimes it is because there's oversensitive college kids who genuinely have sticks up their asses and are like, I don't find anything funny that's funny. Sometimes it's like that. But then other times, you're just not fucking funny.
Right.
Like to Bill Maher, like you stopped being funny like 7 years ago, dog. So like you can't just be, the wokeness, the cancel culture. No, it's that you sort of, and this is Stewart's point, again, something embedded in his argument here is like, update your shit. Like actually make people laugh. Take it as a challenge to, okay, I got to navigate the new waters. So I think if I was in his shoes, I'd probably have a similar position to the one he has. But I think
that's an interesting point.
Since I'm in, well, because again, in the comedian circles, it's 24/7. Everybody bitching about cancel culture. And eventually I'd be like, shut the fuck up about cancel culture. But listen, being in my shoes, the reason why I think I see a little more nuance in this, and I think that it is more of an issue than he certainly thinks it is because, again, I also feel the ramifications of it, in a sense, to a small degree, which is, you know, the moral panic around YouTube and when there was adpocalypse and, oh, my God, a Nestle ad ran on a white nationalist channel, therefore defund all of news and politics. And, oh, my God, we don't know what this crazy guy Kyle is saying. Nobody controls him. He doesn't work for any official organization. So why don't we derank him in the algorithm and make it so that he can't reach as many new people in the audience? And so that also is cancel culture in a sense. Let's prioritize and have a hierarchy of what's acceptable and not acceptable in terms of news and politics. And it's like, once you open that door and start going down that path, there's no closing it. And eventually you have a fucking ministry of truth that tells everybody what they can and can't say.
The sad thing is with YouTube, and I think, you know, like you are and I am on kind of like the front lines of, you see the way that this trickles down through the culture and the kind of widespread effects it has outside of the personal consequences for one particular individual. But I mean, Rising kind of snuck in on YouTube because we were under the corporate umbrella of The Hill. And so we were able to kind of like, you know, make it through that and build an audience that we've been now able to take independent. But, you know, for a new creator in news and politics on YouTube to really get traction and get going, like, it would be almost impossible.
That's
now,
right. Yeah.
Because they've so slanted everything towards New York Times, CNN, MSNBC, who, by the way, purvey their own misinformation.
Oh, for sure.
Plenty of times, but they don't get any penalty for it. But they just have decided that's safer. So, you know, that I consider that to be a tremendous loss, that there are all kinds of brilliant people out there who may have had a path previously to be able to get their views and their analysis and their reporting heard. And that path is effectively closed off now.
Right. Agreed. And so I agree with him that democratizing voices has been good. Democratizing criticism has been good. I think the only part he really misses is that not all criticisms are inherently reasonable, and cancel culture really becomes a problem when it is authoritarian and when you start censoring, deplatforming, firing people, and having real-world consequences for things that, you know, might be wrong to say or even right to say but are just controversial. So, yeah, I think it's a fascinating comment from Jon Stewart. I see a little bit more nuance in it than he does, yeah.
The last thing that I'll say on this is I think there's an assumption from him and a lot of other people that the people who whine about cancel culture, like, they are sort of an elite group. And so they're pushing back against any sort of change. But what we've seen and what we've experienced is that actually the reality of cancel culture has made it much harder for the little guy and girl to come up independently, to have their views and voices heard. So it is an anti-democratizing force. All of this censorship and rigging of the algorithm and deplatforming and all of that is anti-democratic, whereas he thinks that it's actually pro-democratic.
That's a great point, and I'll also add to that, it also kind of sucks all the air out of the room and wastes a lot of energy that could be guided into a constructive way to address the issues that these people claim to care about.
Agreed.
You know what I mean?
Especially on the left. Like, it's anti-solidarity, basically.
Right, exactly. And so just to give one example, you know, the uproar over Dave Chappelle with his special and, you know, the transgender community being angry, or some in the transgender community being angry over it, and some wanting to get the special pulled. What if all that energy, instead of going towards nobody should be allowed to watch this special, what if all that energy went towards a direct effort to get anti-discrimination protections on the book for transgender people in all 50 states? So what if all that energy was directed at the Biden administration to say, right now, trans people are not a protected class. They're not. You know, I think gay people are, different races are, with gender it is, but trans people specifically, there's in over 20 states, there's no protections whatsoever. So in other words, it is theoretically legal for a business owner to say,
directly discriminate.
I don't want to hire you because you're trans, and I think that's weird, and I'm not comfortable with it, so I'm not going to hire you because you're trans. In theory, they can say that, perfectly legal. That's the problem. That's the problem. The problem is, yeah, you know, trans people have a rough go of it. Society has not fully accepted trans people yet by any stretch of the imagination. They get questioned more than anybody else. I think generally homosexuality has been a lot more accepted at this point. Trans people, that's not the case. And you might suffer with job prospects as a result of it if people just think it's weird, if people don't understand it fully. And so getting anti-discrimination protections on the books is super important. And I don't see, now I'm not as familiar with the issue as many others are, so I don't want to speak too broadly here, but all I'll say is certainly the thing the media is focusing on is trans activism insofar as it wants to pull down a comedy special, and not trans activism insofar as it wants to really change the structure of society to get better laws on the books.
Yeah, well, and I suspect that is partly a media problem as well. But to
Yes,
Jon Stewart's point, I shared with you a post that I thought was really instructive that was like, listen, and it was written by a trans person. It was like, listen, I'm not mad at you and trying to get you canceled for telling trans jokes. I'm mad and annoyed that you keep telling the same trans joke that's not funny anymore or creative anymore over and over and over again, and went through like all of them and how repetitive they are, and like how in every special is the same joke. That kind of goes to Jon Stewart's point of like, update your stuff.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean you're like, Dave Chappelle's fine. He's rich. His thing, they're standing by him too, by the way. His thing is not getting pulled.
Which is
but
good.
Like, you know, at least be funny.
Yeah, listen,
It was
in my
very
opinion,
preachy, his
well, that's what I was
special
going to say, is that
preachy and not
Dave
particularly
Chappelle really, I mean, I love Chappelle's show. I'm a huge fan of his stand-up. I do think he's arguably the GOAT when it comes to comedy. But yeah, I watched the most recent special, and it was a little too preachy. Like, it leaned more on the preachiness than, usually the rule for comedians is be funny first, and then whatever else follows. He seemed to put the preachiness first. And so it was sort of like,
it
you're
sort
watching
of felt like the criticism got in his head.
Right, and that would be my advice to Dave Chappelle, too, is stop reading the criticism, man.
Yeah.
How long have you been doing this? You don't know that by now? I stopped reading the criticism a long time ago, and shit, my blood pressure probably went down. I feel a hell of a lot better. Like, you know, there's only so much a human being can take in terms of criticism, where people are telling you stuff about you that you know isn't true. You're going to start to lose your mind. So anyway, that's what I would say to him. And that's a problem for comedians more generally, too, is that I think that's a lot of them might lose their step when they become more preachy than they are, you know, funny. I think there are some exceptions to that rule, like maybe George Carlin and maybe Bill Hicks were examples of like, they're like 40% political commentator, 60% comedian, you know what I mean? And they're in a unique space.
Yeah.
But yeah, most comedians who are pure comedians, if they get too preachy,
Yeah, I mean, Stewart in The Daily Show walked that line very well. But
I think he clearly put comedy first, though. I don't think he was nearly as preachy as even Carlin or Hicks.
Yeah,
I think
that's
he very
probably
clearly, because, you know, ideologically sometimes he'd hit you out of left field with something that you didn't think would be in his wheelhouse, because, again, I think he prioritized the funny over the,
yeah.
you know.
By the way, guys, if you want to see Jon Stewart doing some great work, he tears apart Dennis McDonough, the current Secretary of the VA, in his new show, The Problem with Jon Stewart, in a way that you don't see a single journalist in this town hold people in power to actual account.
Which is so
and
sad.
this was over compensation for people who have suffered horrific injuries and health issues because of exposure to toxic burn pits. So definitely check that out.
Yeah, years later, we're still relying on Jon Stewart to be like one of the best journalists in the country, even though he's not a journalist.